vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови вы насупим, если враг...
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. I have returned to you following various internet issues, and we are now going to be live for the next couple of hours or so. If you have questions, be sure to include them in the chat, and we will get to those as we go through. We will begin with a couple of issues that have been kicking around for the last week or so. So we'll cover those first and get into the questions. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are live currently on YouTube, X, Kick, Rumble, and Twitch. So be sure to subscribe to your platform of choice and the backup platform, because of course you never know when they're going to pull the plug on us. So we will start off this week by taking a look just at a couple of things that have rumbled on in the last week or so in terms of news from perfidious Albion and slightly beyond. And the first of those is, of course, the President of the United States, a man who, in keeping with the last president, appears to have no brain. So always fun when that comes up. And he was in perfidious Albion in the last week or so, meeting with Keir Starmer, the man with no brain himself. So they should have found a lot in common. A man who has no heart, no spine, no brain, no balls. He is just an amorphous floating tub of offal in a badly fitted suit, with a voice like a strangulated gimp trying to enunciate his way through a phone book. So the two of them clearly had much to talk about, and had a ludicrous press conference where Trump, in his usual style, was rambling on about like the fantastical things that go on in his brain, and that one of these was the question of Antifa, which is an obsession with various different Anglo-American reactionaries. And now Trump's talking, I'm going to ban it. I'm going to ban Antifa. Now, it was pointed out on Twitter by the very good Twitter account, actually, called AFL-CIA, if you're not familiar with them. I don't know who runs it, but they... yes, the @ is Union Busting Bot on Twitter. I'm just going to link to their Twitter so you can see it. But they are they're a very good Twitter channel which covers like particularly the AFL-CIO's complicity with American imperialism. So always worth checking them out. But they made a good point, which is that the Antifa slogans, etc., have been registered with like the federal agents, federal law enforcement, as potentially illegal or terroristic slogans since at least the Biden administration. So again, with Trump, like both he and his enemies are engaging in constant smoke and mirrors. The reality of Antifa, as Trump would say, is that, of course, as most of you watching this stream may know, but I'll elaborate on it. There is no single organization in the United States or Britain called Antifa. There's various different groups that trade under that name. And in the United States in particular, over the last decade or so, I mean, these have become the bogeymen par excellence. The reactionaries choose to promote by constantly hysterically ranting and raving about them. And before them, if those of you old enough to remember this, will remember a thing called Black Bloc. Hands up in the chat if you remember Black Bloc, because that was an American thing as well that was big 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And the way in which that was denounced is very similar to the way that Antifa is denounced today. And, you know, for similar reasons and for similar justifications in some aspects. Black Bloc was the anarchists' sort of non-organization or affinity group or whatever they were calling themselves at the time of the anti-globalization movement, and they had a similar reputation, engaged in similar things, fighting with the cops, fighting with reactionaries. It was a street group that appealed to a certain extent to youth in particular. I mean, I found it very appealing, and that was the days when I was in my late teenage years, early 20s, like running around dressing all in black, fighting the cops, etc. All of that used to be, it's the kind of thing that appeals to angsty teenagers, particularly teenage boys, it must be said. Though, there were women in Black Bloc too. There's women in various Antifa organizations. What I found moving amongst people who described themselves as Black Bloc over 25 years ago now is that, actually, I must just be completely accurate, about 22, 23 years ago, was that they were angry, almost entirely untheoretical in terms of actual theoretical development. Not only had they read extremely little, and I think this is true of the Antifa types as well, but they were actively hostile towards learning even the theory of anarchism. They were hostile to. So when I got into anarchism, again, I'm talking like a quarter of a century ago now, I was 18 and wanted to learn all that I could about the anarchist tradition. So I read the History of Anarchism, a book I would still recommend by a rather eccentric academic called Peter Marshall. You can find that easily online. Very interesting stuff. It obviously takes he's a bourgeois academic, and of course a lot of bourgeois academics, especially sort of ex-leftists and even some right reactionaries, have a certain sympathy for anarchism because it enables them to attack communism mainly, but also because it appeals to a certain sort of romantic mentality that certain academics do have. The eternal losers who never came close to power. They do love that. But when I first got into anarchism, I wanted to actually read the theories. So I went out and I read the Marshall book. I read as many articles, writings as I could possibly get hold of by Bakunin. That was fun, especially his discovering his fervent support for the Confederacy in the American Civil War. None of the Antifa types like to linger on that one, I don't think. But also people like Enrico Malatesta, who was one of the granddaddies of anarcho-syndicalism. He's an Italian. Rudolf Rocker, who was another anarcho-syndicalist. He ended up in exile in London, I believe. And also the works of the earlier anarchists, such as William Godwin. I also read, and I wouldn't say that someone like Henry David Thoreau was qualified as an anarchist, but he was referenced in the Marshall book, so I looked him up. And also earlier in the tradition, people like Denis Diderot, who could be conceivably described as a sort of proto-anarchist. Thomas Paine, who wasn't an anarchist, but who sort of was the logical and radical extension of the Enlightenment thought, and the theories of Rousseau when it comes to the state of nature. Now, just to clarify what I mean by the state of nature, the state of nature refers to it's a theoretical concept that refers to a pre-state organization or non-organization of human beings. Like, how did humans live before the imposition of the state? And for anarchists, that's of course a huge thing because the anarchist argument largely consistently throughout the different schools of anarchism, because there's many of them, is that if we do away with the state, then we can essentially move to a situation where we can have a proper relationship between ourselves as humans. Now, that has certain things in common with the higher stage of communism as envisioned by Marx and Engels, as written about by Lenin, Stalin, Mao, etc., but particularly by Marx and Engels themselves, because they came from the same intellectual milieu as the likes of Bakunin and others, about whom I'm reading a very interesting book at the moment, and I will comment on it when I've finished reading that. Bakunin's a fascinating character. He's a complete, in many respects, a buffoon, a provocateur, an adventurer of the most ridiculous kind. Interesting guy, though, to say the least. But the point about the state of nature is that it's the period before the development of human civilization as it stands today, before the development of states, borders, etc. And the whole basis for anarchism is an argument that it is the state's emergence all this time ago, that thousands and thousands of years ago, that distorted human relations. Now, admittedly, some anarchists will stray more towards the Marxist explanation. They will qualify that by saying, this is when anarchists bothered to think, qualify that by saying that each state does represent a slightly different form of oppression. But by the time but the central argument is that to go back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his line of man is born free and yet everywhere he is in chains. Reference back to the emergence of human beings in the state of nature, though when Rousseau says men, he really does mean just men. He had a phenomenal misogynistic attitude towards women. But the basic argument being, we are born into this world as humans. We evolved into the world and lived in ancient societies, in primitive communism, in a time when we had more proper and unmediated relations with each other, not distorted and perverted by the medium of the state and the force of the state. And for some anarchists, they'll say private property as well. For other anarchists, they very much won't. But the point is that there is an origin point for the human race, where our relations were not distorted by the state or private property or both. And this is one of the things I was very keen on finding out about. And so you read William Godwin, one of the founders of the Anglo-American anarchist tradition. You read people like Malatesta, you read people like Rocco, and you read some of the stuff from the Iberian Anarchist Federation. Try and get an impression as to what the theory is here. And I found when I went into the anarchist movement, the Black Bloc law, over 20 years ago, that and I'm not saying this, by the way, this is not just me making empty intellectual boasts. I knew exceptionally little at the time as well. I was just beginning the process of finding stuff out, but I wanted to find stuff out and I wanted to read stuff. But you go into these groups and the attitude is, well, bollocks to theory. And that's not just the anarchists that have a problem with that. That's everybody on the left, basically. They have an extreme allergy to actually, building knowledge. And most of the Black Bloc types that I knew were people who were only really interested in what they called action, meaning running around, either being chased by the cops or periodically brawling with the cops. More likely it's the other way around, more like the cops beat you up when you try and run away from them. Going out, tagging buildings with spray paint, going out, trying to occupy buildings, squat abandoned houses, that kind of thing. Which, and again, the squatters movement after World War II in Britain, that was a real thing, a real working class movement that forced the Labour government at the time into making concessions over housing issues. So I'm not at any stage saying that certain of these things aren't valid. When a squatters movement becomes a mass work is a movement pushed by the working class with a specific set of demands around housing issues, it can become a real potent threat to the ruling class. What the anarchists were doing was not. What the anarchists are doing is basically fetishizing the idea of having a sort of going off grid, so to speak. Americans will be more familiar with this idea because this is actually a big thing in American anarchism. The individualist anarchist tradition of the United States is strong with this, and various other leftist formations in the United States have been fond of this as well. The idea of, well, we're going to go off grid, we're going to we're going to occupy an abandoned house, we're going to form our own commune, we're going to be generate our own electricity or something. All these are ideas that I remember being discussed over 20 years ago. None of it ever happened, of course, because most of these anarchists were actually from quite middle, sort of petty bourgeois families, and just were looking for an adventure for a few years. This is what primarily anarchism is. It's an adventure, and this is the essence of Antifa. It was the essence of Black Bloc as well. Many people in there who want to be revolutionaries, they would wish to be, but who fundamentally they are middle-class adventurers. They're looking for action. They're looking for some kind of like representation of a revolution. And you can find one. I mean, you can go out and brawl with the cops. You can go out and get yourself arrested. You can go out and squat a building and you feel like you're engaging in the revolution. You're not, of course. And this is the essence of the Antifa groups. They are not revolutionaries. Many of the people inside them will think they are, but what you think you are and what you actually are not always the same thing. In fact, they're often completely the opposite. So the Antifa groups in the United States, portrayed by the likes of that fucking clown, Andy No, I think he's like Vietnamese American guy, made his name going and basically recording the worst idiots he could possibly find in the Antifa demonstrations and getting them to say stupid shit on camera. That's basically it. That's what he became famous for. But it conjured this image of Antifa in the mind of reactionaries, which many in of the anarchists, sort of pseudo-Maoists that are involved in the so-called Antifa groups were more than happy to play into, was that this was a sort of giant nationwide US organization that operated in every state of the union, that is round the corner, that is waiting to storm your church, that is looking to force gayness on all of you right now. If you turn away, the gayness will happen, and the Antifas will be in your living room, etc., etc. And this was a bit of a laugh. I remember when, I believe it was back in Trump's first term, that there was the claim that dozens of Antifa super soldiers will descend upon your church or something. And this is something that the Chapo lads, remember them? Are they still around, by the way? Were having a good chortle about. But the idea, of course, is quite useful for repressive regimes. It's useful to have something like Antifa, which is amorphous, which has no national structure, which has no central organization, which is just literally like groups of like very confused, hyperactive young men, especially, who have practically zero or exceedingly little theoretical knowledge, who value action above everything else. They are perfect pawns in the hands of, for instance, the FBI or other law enforcement agencies, because God knows the American state's got plenty of domestic state security forces at its disposal, and has a long-standing, long-established ability to infiltrate these organizations and distort them. So we have had here in Britain the old perfidious Albion story floating around for years and years now. The Association of Chief Police Officers, as it was once called, ACPO, and other law enforcement organizations were sending undercover agents into every left-wing anarchist movement going, It's well established by now that the security forces in Britain try to, in fact, are on record as saying that they were actively looking to place agents inside the old Communist Party of Great Britain. That was something that they were very interested in doing. The official history of MI5 freely admits to this. You can go and buy that off the bookshelf in any high street bookstore. But they were also concerned with infiltrating the environmentalist groups who were very anarchistic in their organization, infiltrating the sort of anti-capitalist movement, infiltrating the Trotskyites. Don't have to work too hard to do that. But they look to infiltrate anything and everything that could be out there that could be a potential source of trouble for the state, even if it's ridiculous. Like why would you even need to bother, if your actual concern was state security, why you'd need to bother infiltrating the Socialist Workers' Party is beyond me. But I think that the reason why they do it, why they do try to infiltrate like Antifa groups, etc., is partly so that they can use them to engage in provocations. And here we get to the point about strategy of tension that is directly related to the whole Charlie Kirk assassination, because it's been absolutely clear from the way that the US federal government, I should say, and its state security agencies has pushed since the assassination of Kirk, this narrative that it's Antifa. Look, this guy's got a trans boy/girlfriend. I mean, they published that ridiculous transcript of his supposed chat with his boyfriend. Like, hello, roommate/boyfriend/genderless person I happen to be on familiar terms with. Would you like to hear about my day today? Yes, I would. Have you done anything? Yes, I have. I could not take the hate of Mr. Charlie Kirk anymore, and that is why I very definitely, in using a certain rifle, carried out an assassination campaign. But sadly for me, the incredibly intelligent Kash Patel heads the FBI now, and I'm certainly doomed. It's a clear and obvious stitch-up. But the thing is, for the Trump political base, or quite a lot of them anyway, and for quite a lot of Americans who have been saturated with propaganda about Antifa as this huge national organization that menaces their very existence, the idea of them, the state taking action against them, has been sold as an appealing idea to these people for years. But of course, Antifa is a phantasm in many respects. If you shine a light on it, it disappears because, again, it has no real organizational structures, not much of one anyway. So what will this actually be used for? And here's the point that I'm going to just conclude my remarks on this on. What it'll actually be used for, this clampdown, is to suppress, first and foremost, any actual working class organization inside the United States that is actually doing serious class-based organizing. Strangely enough, I think there will be symbolic arrests of like Trantifa leaders, if such things even exist, by the FBI. They'll serve up some scalps to Trump to keep him happy. It'll also create some martyrs for the American left to engage in their favorite pastime, which is pointless mourning of. And the other thing to say is about these so-called Antifa groups is that I could be proven wrong about this, and if I am, I'll address it. But my guess is that these groups are at least as penetrated by law enforcement as like the right-wing militia organizations. I don't think there's an awful lot that happens in these Antifa micro groups that the American state and American law enforcement at one level does not know about. Just as there was nothing that in the big right-wing militia scare of like the 1990s. This was a time, of course, a slightly different time. You had Clinton in the White House, but the idea of like this vast army of reactionaries being out there, and that necessitated a huge expansion of the powers and the budget of the FBI and other state local and federal law enforcement agencies. This was a bogeyman that was shoved down the throats of the sort of liberal end of opinion in the United States 30 years ago, and around which like things like the Waco siege, the Oklahoma City bombing, etc. This was central to like this mythology that there's an army of fascists out there on the march. Turns out the army of fascists, and again, I will recommend the book on this by Dr. Wendy Painting on the Oklahoma City bombing, but particularly like she covers the life of a certain Timothy McVeigh. Like McVeigh was an agent for U.S. military intelligence / certain forms of law enforcement. That's pretty damn well established if you read the book by Painting and other sources as well that are credible. Like the man was an agent. Other people he interacted with in that far right milieu, that fascist milieu in the United States, were also agents. So where the organization of the fascists ends and where the state forces directing them begin is sometimes a little bit blurry. But back then, there's no doubt that the principal movers in and around the Oklahoma City bombing, people like McVeigh himself, people like the strangely named Roger Moore, Andreas Strassmeyer, etc. Like these were guys who were very much integrated with the operations of the state, of the American state, and it's not just Marxists who say that. In fact, Marxists in the United States swallowed the line about there being a vast fascist army out there. Like plenty of American libertarians said it as well, and were correct to say so. And as Brian T on X points out, there is also like connections here to the Ukraine thing, and that's another point to mention in this whole Kirk assassination thing. Is like, well, is there a Ukraine connection? There was rumors that there might be, but it hasn't been fully established yet. There was certainly a Ukraine connection with that Ryan Ralph guy who tried to assassinate Trump. Like that guy had been to Ukraine on multiple occasions and was a guest of the American military. It seems he was actually staying at an American military base, I believe, before he assassinated Trump, or tried to assassinate Trump. So what you're seeing with this Antifa nonsense is much less about, well, it's not about a reality at all. It's a show put on to justify repression, and not of the Antifas. I don't think the Antifa organizations will ever disappear from the United States. Strangely enough, the FBI, despite its enormous budget and powers, will never just quite be able to catch them all. Strange that. But what it will do is they'll go after any militant working class organization that actually is worthy of the name. They'll go after any anti-imperialists that are worthy of the name. They'll go after anybody who is doing even like critical reporting on the activities of the American federal government and brand them Antifa or extremist, etc., etc. It'll all be justified to ramp up the level of repression inside the United States. This is what this is all about. And Antifa as a thing is a phantasm. Whether it exists at all outside, whether it would have any independent existence at all outside of the activities of federal, state, and local undercover law enforcement activities is an open question. Right. Irish Partisan says one only needs to look at the antics of the British state using the UVF, UDA, UFF proxies in occupied 6 counties to do their dirty work. These loyalist organizations were fully infiltrated by MI5 and Northern Ireland Special Branch, of course. So that took rather longer than I thought, but it's worth going into a more lengthy explanation now. Going back to just another thing, I noticed that your party, if you've if you've not been following this, Saint Jeremy of Islington, the man who has led his lost tribe into the wilderness and left them there, only to promise to lead them out, only to not. He returned a number of weeks ago now, and we did a video on this, promising to found a new party, and it was going to be called, well, the holding name was Your Party. And he was allegedly going to lead this with a defecting Labour MP called Zara Sultana. And the two of them were going to be leading this together as part of a glorious new chapter in British socialist history. Well, the glorious chapter has lasted about a month, if that. Corbyn and Sultana seem to be at odds from the very beginning. Now, we're going to go more into this in an upcoming episode of Decline and Fall, but I will just say at this stage that it seemed that from the beginning, Sultana wanted to push ahead with forming the party. Corbyn, for reasons that I can't fully establish now, but we have got some interesting stuff coming up on this in an upcoming interview. So stay tuned on the Decline and Fall channel for it. But it seems that Corbyn and his clique, wanted to have complete control over this party. They, whilst talking the same usual flannel about democracy and power to the membership, and Corbyn doesn't mention the socialism word anymore, of course. Wasn't ever been big on that. He's just sort of generic. He comes up with these generic slogans about like fairness and justice and peace and whatever the fuck. But it seems that he and his clique, the same clique, which by the way ran the Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party into the ground and oversaw a complete fuck up in terms of the election in 2019. I mean, how do you lose to Boris Johnson? A human blancmange with a blonde wig attached, and yet you managed to lose to him. How do you do that exactly? But they managed it. They managed it by systematically fucking up every single time the ruling class and the state machine in Britain threw a challenge their way, as they were always going to. These people picked exactly the wrong way to respond to it. They picked at a way that only conveyed weakness and dithering and cowardice and evasiveness every single time they were challenged. That's what they did, to the point where you start to believe that only part of this is down to the fact that the social democratic politics of Corbyn and co are fundamentally ridiculous, because they don't have a clear understanding of what British capitalism is. They don't have a clear understanding of what British imperialism is and what Britain as an imperialist country actually means in terms of how its economy functions and how its state functions. They don't have an understanding of any of that. So they are going to make all of these mistakes, of course. But it's not just that. It's not just that they are a disaster, politically speaking. It's that there are people who move amongst this group who are, I think it can be said, assets of the British state in some form or another. Now, there's been a lot of writing done on this by David Miller, who's a prominent, he's the prominent anti-Zionist academic in Britain. You can find him easily on Twitter. Also by a guy called Phil Bevan, who is associated with the Workers' Party of Britain, the WPB, who God knows I've got my political problems with, but Bevan was in the Labour Party. He was in its headquarters, I believe. He's written on his Patreon quite extensively about that, about the potential for sort of, should we say, intelligence infiltration of the Corbyn leadership. And David Miller's done some stuff on the Plan C organization, which I'm hoping to get him on the show for Decline and Fall this week coming up. So I'll be asking him about that particular question. So there is all kinds of all kinds of moving pieces to this foolishness. Corbyn and his clique of, shall we say, very shady, possibly intelligence agency infiltrated or aligned group of advisors who managed to fuck up every single thing when it came to the Labour Party leadership, wanted to have complete control over the subsequent political formation. Sultana had a different approach, it would seem, though whether that was any good or not is another question. The two of them seem to be constantly like falling out with each other because of the slightly different approaches each of them was taking, to the point where Sultana the other day launched a membership drive after having formed a private company to handle the membership drive. Corbyn and his group insisted that this was too early, that they didn't need to be taking like paid membership applications yet. It should be emphasized. It should be emphasized that that neither of them are actually committed to anything really. They are completely dedicated to the same form of very watery social democratic politics. In fact, to call it social democratic would be to give it too much credit. Very watery sort of left liberal nonsense, as epitomized by Sultana herself. But what seems to be happening is a falling out over who gets to run things. Now, bear in mind, Sultana is now saying that she wants to open up for membership. They don't even have a party name yet. They don't even have like we don't even have the details of like whatever conference is happening. Their local meetings that are accredited to being organized by your party seems to be selected by like not through any sort of public or democratic process, but through a sort of whispering campaign amongst certain leftist cliques. So this is a disaster. Corbyn is threatening legal action, or forces around Corbyn are threatening legal action. So it's completely disintegrating before it's even got started. And I will be delving more into this in the upcoming week, because I think it's very interesting that they couldn't even, with like a degree of enthusiasm, it has to be admitted to. I mean, we have to say that like they did get a significant number of people signing up. Now, the difference between signing up and doing anything is huge, but that is a significant number of people that they got on their mailing list, and that's fundamentally what it is. It's a mailing list. But to not be able even to hold it together to the point where you have a founding conference, even one that's completely stitched up, speaks volumes to the sheer dysfunctional, piss poor nature of like these people's organizational skills, and also to let's be honest, to the mendacity of a lot of these people, which is that if they can't completely control something, they'll completely destroy it. There you go. And that tells you all you need to know about the Corbyn leadership as well, as when he was leader of the Labour Party. Because if they're that dysfunctional, when they're supposedly free of the control of the Labour Party right wingers and the Labour Party bureaucracy, they don't have any of these constraints anymore, and they're still awful. My God, it's amazing that they lasted 4 years in the leadership position. Right, we'll come back to the Your Party disaster later in the week, but now it's time to throw over for questions. First question in the chat today came from Svetlana, who asked about the laws from the Stalin period against homosexuality in the USSR. Now, what this refers to is in the period immediately after the October Revolution, there was a sort of burst of radicalism around like figures such as Alexandra Kollontai and others regarding what the relationship between men and women should look like under socialism, what the family unit should look like under socialism. And for a lot of people, including the likes of Kollontai, the revolution wasn't just merely about overturning the Tsardom and the Russian capitalist class, etc. The revolution was also about overturning like all the elements that made up like class-based societies. That meant reconsidering the family in a new way, and this was went along with the early Bolshevik government overturning like the traditional sort of Russian the Tsardom's ban or restrictions on homosexuality, and that homosexuality was legalized. Now, this was part of this early radical period, which comes to a close after the early 1920s, and the turn that happens with regard to the laws on homosexuality is informed by different positions which existed in the CPSUB at the time, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks. There were those like Gorky and others who said that homosexuality was a bourgeois deviation, a bourgeois perversion, meaning it was a thing that was engaged in by essentially very rich men as an expression of their fundamentally perverse nature as rich men. So the question of like, and this wasn't just a Russian view, by the way. It was a view that was very common at the time. The view it was taken by a lot of people in the workers' movement was that homosexuality in particular, they sort of ignored lesbianism, was a pursuit of like perverted rich men, you know. So this is the way it was viewed at the time. It went alongside the idea that it was being pushed by the bulk of the Soviet Party at the time, that they had to address the what had been quite a low birth rate for some time. They had to address the question of needing to sort of restore Russian working class family life, and this is something that needed to be prioritized. So I think those things are in the mix as to sort of why the initial lifting of the prescription on homosexuality was reversed by the early 1930s. And was that a mistake? Probably it was. Was it a mistake that had certain explanations for it? Yes. So, but to follow up on Svetlana's question, it was certainly a mistake. There's absolutely, I mean, homosexuality is as old as the hills in the human species. There's always been a very small minority of men and a very small minority of women who wish only to pursue sexual and shall we say long-term emotional relationships with those of the same sex. That's always been the case. Wasn't invented by capitalism. It's been there from the very beginning, and therefore it's something which I think is best viewed in the way that the more modern understanding of these things brings us, which is that as this is anything which involves two adults looking to engage in sexual relations or build some kind of life together, to legally prescribe that is wrong. Now, and that was a mistake that was made at the time. Even the greatest and most heroic of periods in our history contain mistakes, and that was certainly one of them. Now, just to answer the second part of Svetlana's question, with regard to what should the attitude of communists be to homosexuality, lesbianism today? Well, the attitude should be, I think, that we as communists don't wish to engage in the reactionary moves like legally prescribing what two adults can do. What to use the old-fashioned term, consenting adults can get up to in terms of like sexual relations or emotional relations. That is an incorrect approach to try and do that, and therefore we shouldn't. And in terms of the relationship between communism and what's referred to as gay liberation, I would say that the as has been proved in the bourgeois states, in the imperialist states these days, the attempts to sort of marry up what's referred to as gay liberation and class struggle have always ended with the bourgeois gay rights organizations coming out on top, so to speak, because what is fundamentally the case is that in terms of bourgeois legal equality, this can be given under conditions of even decaying capitalism when it comes to same-sex relationships. What can't be done in terms of in these terms is not related to people's sexuality. So if you're rich and if you're a rich gay man now in the West, the world is your oyster as much as it would be as if you were rich and straight. So the issue isn't sexuality. The issue for people's liberation isn't sexuality. The issue is class position. The issue is like, where do you stand in the class hierarchy of these decaying imperialist countries? So these days, what's been proven by the development of rather liberal laws when it comes to homosexuality and lesbianism is that they can remove the liberal system can remove the oppression based on sexuality, purely on sexuality. What it can't, and indeed will never remove, is the oppression and exploitation based on class. Can't do that. And so therefore the liberation of all is contingent upon the changing the mode of production and chasing the bourgeoisie out of power. The liberation of the working class has nothing to do with sexuality. Our attitude should be that we don't support state persecution of consenting adults who want to pursue relationships with those of the same sex. We don't support that. But it's got nothing to do with communism. It's got nothing to do with Marxism. It's got nothing to do with the working class movement, other than the fact that the removal of legal restrictions on, again, like the sexual and emotional lives of adults and between adults is something that is a progressive move to redress like a historic injustice that was perpetrated, by the way, by the bourgeois state in the first place. I mean, people mention like the USSR when it comes to restrictions on homosexuality. Those were the same restrictions. Similar restrictions existed inside all of the bourgeois states at the time. Bear in mind, homosexuality in Britain was only legalized in the 1960s. The legal prescriptions on homosexuality remained inside the United States in some states up to the 2000s with the anti-sodomy laws, etc. The idea that this was like a terrible thing done by the evil Stalin is a lie made up by reactionaries. But in terms of the in terms of the future, in our attitudes in the future, is that what I would say is also is that draw a distinction between the removal of legal restrictions and the removal of restrictions on people's on adults' ability to pursue relationships which seem best for them. That's something which is something which needs to be, of course, maintained. But also then you reach the end of that and you go into LGBTQ plus ideology, which is something which is genuinely which is a creation of like the NGO state, academia, and some fuckery from the security services, which is designed to, in fact, elevate very small minority sexualities and, let's be honest, habits into something which is not just a question of like redressing a needless and reactionary move in terms of legal restrictions on homosexuality, but then to actually elevate minority sexualities into a superior position, culturally speaking, which is a project that's been pursued by certain very well-funded elements in the United States and elsewhere. That also is used to sort of as part of the battering ram of color revolutions in neo-colonial nations, etc. All of that kind of nonsense needs to be pushed out. Now, to answer S.W. Haster's question, is LGBTQ an ideology? Well, it's become part of the system. That's the thing. There's homosexuality, but for male and female homosexuality, which has always existed, which has since the earliest days of human development. Then there is that. Then there is this modern thing, which is taking the necessary achievements in terms of gaining legal equality under the liberal capitalist system, and then there's taking a sort of distorted form of gay rights and like promoting it through the NGO system as a form of ideology attached to imperialism, and as a rainbow flag draped battering ram, which they use to assault neo-colonial nations, and they use for propaganda purposes in the imperial core countries as well. That's all. That's all there in the system as it stands now, and that kind of like ideology, which has been constructed by bourgeois academia since the 60s, is something we very much stand against. Right. So going on to other questions now, just taking a pause. So the next question comes from Comrade Beans, which is why is Russia not imperialist? And this is a question that came in on Telegram. Now let's have a look at how the comrade worded this. Quote, I was wondering, is there a simpler way to explain it to people? Should they ask me how I know? You covered a lot of historical points on your live stream. I'm curious as a way to boil it down to get to some easy to get across points. Yes, there is a way of like doing this, which is quicker, but you should always encourage everybody to read, of course. But of course, if you engaged in a debate discussion, there are certain things which you can emphasize straight away. To start off with, I would say that go through a mental checklist yourself, and then use this to sort of formulate your response to people in discussions. First of all, we need to ask what actually constitutes an imperialist country. Now, what constitutes an imperialist country, according to Lenin, is that it moves into a position where there is a move from the production of commodities to the production and export of commodities being the primary method of generating profits, to the movement of capital being the primary method of generating profits for the ruling class. Now, that takes place over a number of decades in Britain, France, the United States, Germany, etc. But it does occur. Now, where is Russia when it comes to that development? Is it the case that Russia is a primarily exporter of capital or commodities? The answer is that Russia is primarily an exporter of commodities and not an exporter of capital. There are arguments about, oh, Russian capitalists export this capital here, there, and everywhere. But even when it comes to Russian oligarchy exporting their capital to somewhere like Cyprus, what they're doing isn't investing it in the way that the imperialists do in the West. What it is simply taking their loot out of Russia and stashing it somewhere. It's not even got to the point where they are strong enough and well developed enough to actually get to the point where they move into the imperialist period, because the imperialist period is moved into by the fact that there is this inherent pressure within capitalism to, as Marx pointed out himself, to remove as many costs as possible from the process of generating more capital, generating profit. So labor is a cost, raw resources, both extraction and processing, development of raw resources is a cost, transportation is a cost, the spending money on means of production is a cost, spending money on maintaining means of production is a cost, workers' wages is a cost, storage of commodities is a cost. These are all costs which extract from the final amount of profit you can make as the capitalist. So there's always this inherent urge within capitalism to try and eliminate the costs involved. And so what they do is they try and find ways around this. Now, the development of imperialism in the 19th century is very much part of this process. So what you find is that, just pause for another coffee injection. What you find is that in Britain, the capitalists stop investing in means of production as much and start to look to export their capital to make money to make more profit at a greater rate of return elsewhere than they would by continually investing in new means of production. This happens everywhere. And that's the moment when they start developing an imperialist system. So it's, first of all, it's a move from the production being concerned primarily with the production and export of commodities to the export of capital. Excuse me. And also it's the merging together of money capital and industrial capital to form finance capital, with the banks in a absolutely leading and crucial role in that process. And you then have to look at, well, what actually develops in Russia in the 1990s and 2000s? What you find in Russia in the 1990s and 2000s isn't a bourgeoisie which is strong, like whatever you think of the British, French, German, American bourgeoisie by the end of the 19th century. These are all strong ruling classes to varying different degrees, and they reach a point where they have been phenomenally successful, at least in terms of Britain, but in terms of developing industrially their own homeland. And it reached the point where they could no longer make enough profit doing that. Now, what did the Russian ruling class reach in the 1990s? What were they doing? They were subordinating the nation to the United States. There's no arguments about that anymore. Not really. Not any serious ones. That's what they were doing. And the situation in Russia in the 90s reached a point where they could no longer. They were faced with a huge crisis in terms of the ability of the state to hold itself together. The Putin system is not a development like the emergence of finance capital in Germany, which is it develops under the Kaiserreich system, not the computer game, but the system of the Second Reich, as the Hitlerites put it later, which is you have a very strong state run by nominally by the Kaiser, but in actual fact the cabinet of ministers, where you have a very, very strong banking system, which again merges them with industrial capital to create German finance capital. What you have in Russia in the 1990s and the early 2000s, when Putin emerges, is a state which is almost broken down. Is a state where you have not strength, not success of capitalism, but the complete and total failure of capitalism, where the attempt to create Russian capitalism almost completely falls apart. And to save it, a section of the, I think they call them the Siloviki, around Putin and a number of others around the sort of St. Petersburg political clan, many of whom, like Putin, came out of like the intelligence agencies in the late Soviet period. And what they had to do to save the Russian state from complete disintegration was to essentially carry out a Bonapartist maneuver to create a system which elevated the Russian state to a position where it got to a certain extent, dictate to the oligarchs as to how they could behave. Their first priority was saving the Russian state from total disintegration. And it wasn't a total dictating to the oligarchs. There was a lot of bargaining and negotiating going on, which is why, by the way, that the oligarchy continued to export it, or should we say export its loot out of Russia, as the KPRF complains, all the way through like the 2000s and 2010s. They continued to export it to Cypriot, European, British, and American banks. And via that, hundreds of billions of rubles left the Russian system and were stashed in the West. That's where these frozen Russian assets, a lot of them, come from. Like it's stuff that oligarchs were storing in European, British, and American banks, along with certain things from the Russian state as well. But that's why they could seize so many oligarchs' assets in the period after 2022, because so much capital had been parked there. Now, this again is a fundamentally different thing from the development of imperialism in the West. And now the role that the Russian capitalist class wanted to play, and where they were shaping or trying to shape the Russian state according to this need, was to essentially just act as a resource appendage of Europe and the United States, Europe in particular. That's the plan that they had. That's where the bulk of their profits were coming from. And also, it must be said that the Russian capitalist class wanted to be integrated into particularly a European system. If you see that one of the problems that the Russians had was that their gas turbines, and this is for a country which produces a hell of a lot of gas, their gas turbines were all produced by Siemens, the German company. They've just started replacing them with gas turbines made by the Iranians. And what does this mean? It means that the Russian capitalist class not only wanted themselves to be essentially a resource appendage of the West, they actively destroyed the old Soviet industries that would enable greater technological independence, and pursued a strategy of making themselves technologically dependent upon German, French, and British, but particularly German capital, because they were looking to essentially be the resource appendage of a German-dominated Europe. That's what they wanted. Bear in mind, the European Union is principally a political expression of two things. Firstly, German imperialism. Secondly, French imperialism. And those are the two deciding powers in Europe. Britain was for a while, but well, we all know what happened there. The point about this is, though, that the reason why Putin prioritized relationships with German imperialism in the 2000s and 2010s, reason why those Nord Stream pipelines were built was because this was part of the strategy of the Russian ruling class, which Putin reflects, even though it's a Bonapartist system. They had the idea that they were going to be, like, say, Germany's resource appendage. That was the plan of the Russian capitalist class. Now, it's a fucking terrible plan, and it was destroyed by dint of the fact that the Germans, the German imperialists, more than no more and no less than the British or the Americans, wanted to make sure that Russia remained completely and utterly subjugated. What the Russian capitalist class was looking for was some form of partnership whereby they would provide resources and they would get a certain amount back in return, and they would be allowed to operate within their country whilst being in business with the Europeans, and that they would get to put their money where they wanted to, etc., etc. Now, there's a lot of countervailing influences inside Russia, and so what emerges is this strange hybrid, where on the one hand, the Putin system was looking to reassert the power of the Russian state over the capitalist class, but also was still pursuing that capitalist class strategy, albeit they were doing it at a slightly more aggressive bargaining position. Now, again, like, none of this goes along with the idea that Russia is an imperialist power. Its capitalist class is too weak, too pathetic, too useless to be an imperialist power. They're not even as developed as they were back in the pre-1917 revolutionary period, where, due to intense economic development in the west of the old Tsarist Empire, they had at least reached the point where they were looking to export capital in pre-1917 Russia. Back then, they had reached a point of industrial development where they were looking to export capital to other places in Eastern Europe. That was what was behind the drive to war in 1914, which was principally a drive to war that was pushed by the Russian bourgeoisie, greedily eyeing the disintegrating Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, by the way. So they're not even, the Russian capitalist class today aren't even at the point that their ancestors were in, like, 1914. They are completely dependent upon the Russian state. The Russian state is, I wouldn't say it's independent of class relations, but it is more typically Bonapartist than its predecessor was in the pre-1917 period. A lot of the well, of course, a lot of the industrial legacy they draw on is socialist in origin. But principally, to go back to answer Beans's question, Russia is an exporter, not primarily not of capital, but commodities. Two, the Russian capitalist class never developed powerfully enough to the point where it could actually start pursuing imperialism. It was always a very weak, very sickly recreation of its past self in the 1990s and 2000s. Three, stemming from that, is the fact that Russia, via the activities of its capitalist class, was being kept in subjugation or trying to be subjugated by the West, or trying to be kept in perpetual subjugation by the West. And four, that that if you look at the activities in terms of Russian foreign policy since the coming to power of Putin, what it's principally been about is restoring the power of the Russian state, but also, and again, consistently seeking accommodation with the imperialist powers. Like, there was so many times in over the years, over the last 21 years, where the imperialists were obviously engaging in a maneuver in Ukraine, that the Russians just essentially wanted to sign a deal with them and move on. 2004 Orange Revolution, like Russians essentially did not very much of anything at all. They, Putin sat down and shook hands and made nice with Yushchenko, the West's chosen man. They were willing to do that after 2014. Again, this is all due to the interests of the Russian capitalist class that pushed them in that direction. But again, doesn't say that doesn't speak to this Russia as an imperialist power, because Russia was an imperialist power looking to simply dominate and absorb Ukraine, as is the allegation from the Western liberals. Then they would have acted in 2004. If they were looking to re-establish the Tsardom, as is often claimed by Western liberals, if they were looking to do that, then they would have tried to swallow Georgia in 2008. Then they would have moved immediately against the Maidan regime in 2014. None of this happened. And none of it happens because what the Russian system is looking to do is to simply defend the Russian state as it currently exists, to defend the ability of the Russian state to essentially maintain its integrity, territorial integrity, and to essentially get a deal out of the US that will allow the Russian capitalist class to assume what they see as their place within what is still a US-led system. Now, that's not the activities of a rising imperialist power. It really isn't. That's the activities of a weak, subservient, and pathetic class, which is what Russian capitalism is, which, for all its bellicose nonsense about, we are the sons of Ivan the Terrible, we are the descendants of Peter the Great, we will force you to be God-fearing Orthodox Christians, for all that fucking drivel that they engage in. These people are desperate to return to their position as loyal servants of the US. Now, they want to be treated with respect. They want to be treated as partners. But a lot of the Russian capitalists are fully willing to play a subservient role to the United States. The problem that they've got is that the US won't let them. That's the thing. The problem that they've got is that the crisis of US imperialism has reached a point where it has to destroy, or try to destroy, its biggest potential competitors. And the other problem, of course, that the Russian capitalist class has got is that they have an opposition in Russia consisting of communists who keep pushing in the other direction. And so to go back to the point about, is Russia an imperialist nation? No, at the moment it's not. And a big part of the reason why it's not is the sheer weakness of its capitalist class, that is weaker today than its predecessors were in 1914, which has only sought, even in the time of Putin, an accommodation with the West, never sought domination on its own. And these are the principal reasons why I would say that Russia is not an imperialist power. Now, if it'd be useful, I can write this down into some form of a sort of quick reference point if comrades think that will be useful. But to answer Beans's follow-up question, which is related to another Russian question, and reads as follows. You mentioned in one of your live streams about how Russia could become socialist again without a revolution due to the Communist Party being the opposition party. What I'm curious about is, do you think that socialism created by the Communist Party taking over the government will be as strong as the socialism built by Lenin, or would it be more like revisionist socialism, since it is not tempered by the struggle of the proletarian masses? Which is a very good question. Now, let's emphasize this point. If the KPRF, Communist Party of the Russian Federation, was to actually win control of the Russian Duma or to win control of the Russian office of president, they would be in a very powerful position, potentially. But as Beans's question correctly points out, it wouldn't be like this wouldn't be 1917 all over again, because the Russian state as it currently stands is a very strange hybrid of all the different aspects I've just been talking about. And again, if you want to read about the different power groups, the Putin paradox by Professor Richard Sakwa is a good starting point for this. But what you've got in Russia is a Bonapartist constitution that was put in place by the Yeltsinites in the 1990s to specifically create like a Pinochet type system that would create maximum repression towards the Russian proletariat and to maximize the ability of the Russian piratical, treacherous, cowardly, feeble capitalist class to loot as much out of the country as possible and to keep the country in perpetual submission to the United States. That's why, of course, Bill Clinton and co. were very keen on the Russian Constitution of 1993 as it was put together by Yeltsin, because it secured the reign of their man. So, but it is a system now which has extensive control over certain industries, which has increased to a certain degree state control over banking, and all of this does puts more power in the hands of the Russian federal government, economically speaking, than was there in the 1990s or early 2000s. And this has been forced by the various different U.S. presidential administrations, Obama, Trump, Biden, etc., ramping up the sanctions and forcing the Russian state to take on a more proactive role in terms of economic management. Now, should the KPRF win the presidency, in theory, and can control the Duma, it can push for various different socialistic changes. However, this does not take into account various different problems. Firstly, the power of the Russian capitalist class themselves would still be there, even if you won an election. They would resist. Now, the ironic thing about all of this is that one of the traditional ways the capitalist class resists reforms is by capital flight. And the biggest barrier to capital flight out of Russia now was actually being placed there by the imperialists. Now, I'd be curious to see if suddenly the KPRF came to power in Russia, what attitude would the imperialists take? They would be then caught in a dilemma of their own making, because they still require the collapse of Russia, but they would then be faced with a situation where their allies they would need to try and ally themselves to the Russian capitalist class. So they would need to try and remove their sanctions on Russia whilst not looking as if they're making concessions. So it would be a strange thing for them to pull off. Not that I don't think that they would do it, but the point is that winning the state power in the bourgeois elections would only be the start. A Russian communist government would then need to reckon with the power of the Russian capitalist class, not just to export their capital, but to wreck and decimate Russian industry, which they still have the capacity to do in certain areas. You also have the fact that you have an enormous state bureaucracy in Russia. In fact, it's bigger now than it was in 1991, where in terms of the bureaucracy that was associated with the running of the RSFSR, Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic. So you have a bigger bureaucracy now inside Russia than you did in 1991. It's a bureaucracy which will have its divisions, and no doubt, but a lot of them are pro-capitalist and are looking to use their state position to develop personal fortunes for themselves. They wouldn't want the return of socialism to Russia. So you have a state bureaucracy in Russia that will be hostile, much as you would anywhere. If a communist or socialist party that wanted to change the system or push it in the direction of socialism gains power, you have a hostile state bureaucracy. You also have in Russia, despite the well, I don't know how this has developed in recent years, but like you also have then the special bodies of armed men, military, the various branches of that, the police, the intelligence services. Now, the curious thing in Russia is that there will be bits of the military, bits of the intelligence services, and even the police system, which will be run by, will have significant numbers of people in them who are pro-Soviet or pro the what they regard as the positives of the Soviet period. So there is, I mean, I'm not well read enough on this subject, but there are elements within both the hierarchy and lower down in the military and the intelligence services in Russia, which would be in favor of the establishment of some kind of revived socialism in Russia. How their understanding of that might be wildly different to mine, but there is a pro-Soviet mentality in some of these institutions, at least amongst some of the characters in them, which would make a difference in terms of the ability of any communist party-led government to enforce its will. But to go back to Comrade Beans's question about, is this different? Is this something which is fundamentally different than a socialism forged by the struggle of the masses? This is the most crucial point, which is that any socialist government that came to power in Russia, most likely way will be led by the KPRF, but any government which came to power there, which wanted to pursue socialist change, would need to draw upon the strength of the masses in terms of it would need to mobilize them. It would need not just in terms of demonstrations, but do things like has been that which has been done in a place like Venezuela or Nicaragua, or for instance, learning from the Cuban example, which is you couldn't just rely upon a hostile, or at least a somewhat hostile state bureaucracy, a very hostile Russian capitalist class, and state forces of at least mixed and dubious loyalty. If you relied on that, you'd be finished. And do not underestimate the willingness of the Russian capitalist class and their collaborators to shove the nation right back into the shithole again if they thought that socialism was seriously going to threaten their interests. So you need the masses, you need the Russian proletariat to not just march in solidarity with you, but also mobilize in defense of a rebuilding of Russian socialism, meaning that you would need to do something like revive the Soviets. Now, this is a demand that the Russian Communist Party of the Russian Federation has talked about. They've talked about the need to repeal the Constitution of 1993, and the meaning that, because what was, if you look back, I mean, maybe it's time pretty soon that we need to do another stream on Black October. But in 1993, one of the difficulties that the Yeltsinites were having was that they were still operating within the constitution of the RSFSR, albeit with the various, perversions of it that Gorbachev and Yeltsin had stuck onto it. But the Soviets at the local level were still there. That's where the resistance to Yeltsin came from. It was actually from the Soviets. That's why the principal opposition came from what was still referred to as the Supreme Soviet of Russia. And so it was because the representatives there, no matter which group they came from, were more reflective of the Russian working class than you would find today. So the demand of the KPRF has been to scrap essentially the changes that were put in place after 1993 and to bring back the Soviet system, as far as I understand it. That's the articles I've read on their website, meaning that essentially you reestablish or try and reestablish working class power via like restoring what was there in pre-Black October. And that's a big part of the way in which they would seek to mobilize the Russian masses in defense of the revolution or defense of a new Russian socialism. Now, whether that would work or not is something which, again, like I am not going to say yay or nay on at this point, because I don't feel I've read enough to actually say so. But they do have, it would seem, a plan to deal with this. And I think also combined with an appeal to the Russian working class to an appeal to the Russian working class to mobilize, a consistent attempt to draw upon the politicization of the Russian working class, which seems to have taken place in the period of this Russian special military operation. An appeal to those elements in the armed forces and the internal security structures in Russia who are pro-Soviet to come forward and defend the revolution, or defend the new revolution, shall we say. That could seek to deal with the counter-revolutionary moves that would be made, undoubtedly be made, by the Russian capitalist class, by those within the Russian bureaucracy, military and security services who would be dead set against a return to socialism, and who would happily, as they did in the past, go and collaborate with the US imperialists, the British imperialists, the German imperialists to try and wreck any return to socialism. But the KPRF plan probably has more chance of succeeding now than it did 10 years ago, because now you have had a whole load of, possibly like over 1 million, I would say that by now, men principally, but women as well, who have experienced in one form or another the special military operation, who have had like a crash course in political education about the role of the imperialists and also the role of the Russian capitalists, and who have seen clearly with their own eyes the destruction and the weakening of the country that came about via the restoration of capitalism, and who want to move and who don't want to return to that, which is why the United Russia Party, which is nominally loyal to Putin, but he's not a member of it, all very complicated. He has been with it at certain points, looks a bit nervous these days, I think, because they realize that there is an increasing amount of politicization going on, and that the Russian government has been forced into adopting, to a large extent, like a defense of large aspects of the Soviet period. Again, mainly thanks to the activities of the imperialists. So we should really thank Comrade Biden for his staunch service to defend the Soviet legacy. But again, a key part of the reason why the Soviet legacy inside Russia can be defended, again, credit where credit is due, have to give credit to the KPRF for doing that. Whereas in so many other places, it was only such as Ukraine, there were attempts to do that, but sadly unsuccessful. KPRF have been very successful at defending the historical memory, which is absolutely vital, given that historical nihilism is one of the key weapons of anti-communism. So we will have to see. To sum up and answer Comrade Beans' question, it would not just be a case of winning an election, presidential or parliamentary or both. There would need to be a revolutionary process that the Russian communists would need to engage in. Now, that would follow specifically Russian characteristics, of course, but there would have to be an appeal to the masses. There would have to be an attempt to mobilize the masses in the defense of the revolution. There would have to be, the KPRF would have to be able to carry through their commitment to undoing the Constitution of 1993 and restoring the Soviet system, restoring the constitution of the RSFSR, which is the basis upon which the Russian Federation actually emerged as a truncated part of the former Soviet Union. It emerged as a country under the constitution that had been part of the old Soviet system. So restoring that, restoring the Soviet power, restoring the Supreme Soviet, those would all be methods by which the socialist transformation could be safeguarded. But you would be very foolish to think that just by winning elections, that somehow would, under a bourgeois system, you would somehow be able to proceed without problems. No, you would absolutely need to be not only be aware of the machinations of the ruling class, the capitalist class, but also make those clear to the Russian proletariat and make it clear what we are fighting against. Only via the politicization, mobilization of the masses can any revolution or revolutionary process be defended. And that's been proved comprehensively by places like Venezuela these days as well. Right. Moving on then, we had a question from Anthony in Prague about scientific socialism. Now, I am going to take a brief pause here to refresh my coffee, and then I will be back with you in about 5 minutes. So be sure to like and share the stream. Be sure to subscribe to the channels. I'll be back with you in around about 5 minutes when I've just got a bit more to drink. Okay, we're back. Slightly less than 5 minutes there. So we move on, and I'll handle a question from Anthony in Prague, first of all, which related to the question of scientific socialism, which, according to Anthony, is more appealing than so-called democratic socialism, which is, of course, one of the feeblest titles of all time, but also Anthony's wording was, I think, it seemed rather cold, and would it really appeal to the masses? Now, here I think we need to be specific in terms of what we're looking to do in different parts of the world. Now, in terms of to answer your question straight away, would it have an appeal to the masses? I think it would, because I think it would enable us to actually. It would be part of our push to promote the Enlightenment legacies of rationality and reason amongst the masses, and also popularize the development of a greater understanding of what science and the scientific method means amongst the masses. Bear in mind, what we want to do is to reach a point where as many workers as possible can play their part in the governing of the country, And we only get that by increasing the ability of each person to apply reason in an analysis in day-to-day life. So yes, I think it would have an appeal to the masses. To answer Dimitri's question, the coffee was already made. I just had to put it in the microwave. So cheers. I am not drinking whiskey Lyonnais. That is something that I will not be doing, except for perhaps a Christmas special. Maybe, if we get around to it. So to go back to the scientific socialism question, scientific socialism, of course, as expressed by Engels in Anti-Düring, part of which was trimmed to make the pamphlet Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. The reason why Marx and Engels were so keen on this, were wanted to develop this, was because these men were both very much the children of the Enlightenment. They grew up through the intellectual traditions that made the French Revolution, that made the Napoleonic state. Look, I'm not getting into a debate over microwaving coffee here. If you make it strong enough, microwaving it doesn't ruin it. Trust me. Anyway, the Enlightenment traditions that made the French Revolution and the subsequently progressive elements of the Napoleonic period, and these Marx and Engels were part of a generation who were born immediately after the final defeat of Napoleon, who embraced that tradition of developing of a scientific understanding of the world. And scientific socialism, I think, is something which a lot of people have talked about, but few of us ever actually managed to practice. Because what it's based upon is this, well, there's several things it's fundamentally based upon, but I always took it to mean that basically, if you are practicing scientific socialism, you can take and test your concepts amongst the masses and essentially, in a scientific fashion, record what is successful and what is not. You are like a good scientist. A scientific socialist is constantly testing things. You're constantly testing how a slogan goes down with the masses, how a particular policy goes down, how a method of organizing or campaigning goes down. Is it successful? We established like how, what are our parameters of success? Are we reaching them? And socialism, scientific socialism, means constantly assessing, testing, evaluating, and seeing if we're actually reaching our objectives, and be it adopting a scientific approach in terms of analyzing if what we are doing is working at each stage. Now, I know a lot of people out there are going to say, no, it's not about that, it's about feelings. Well, what are feelings fundamentally? Well, let's not get into that. Could be here all night. But the point is that it absolutely is something that we should be promoting. Absolutely, because it points to our end, and if not our end point, then the method by which we'll get to the end point, which is the spreading of shall we say, an understanding of how to organize society based on reason and analysis, and based on the development of the scientific understanding. And based on what we want to do is to develop the critical thinking and analysis skills that lay within a lot of people dormant for their entire lives. Most people, and we've talked about this before, never fully express their intellectual capacities throughout their lives. This goes for the entire world, or should we say, most of the world. There's arguments to say that this is more possible in socialist countries, or countries which are on the road to socialism. But in a capitalist country like Britain, like the US, the great bulk of the population will not be able to fully develop their intellectual capacities under this system. It's not only not encouraged, it's positively discouraged. And what we want to do is to fully develop the human capacity for reason and understanding. And for this, I would say that scientific socialism is not only something that we should defend, but we should positively advocate for. Now, how we do that, these are questions which have to be tackled. We don't go out with a giant essay on a piece of cardboard saying, find out about scientific socialism, ask me how. But it's something which must guide our not only our analysis, but the means by which we build our parties, the means by which we operate, the way in which we assess things. And that doesn't mean everything has to be about cold, hard stats and facts, etc. But it does mean that we have to take a scientific approach in looking at these things. Now, we could probably, at a certain point, do like many hours on like what that means. But I think it's something that we should defend, and it's something that we will definitely do more programs on here on the channel in the near future. Now, question coming in, or request, I should say, coming in from YepX, who says, can you do a separate live stream discussing the McCarran Internal Security Act, named after its primary author, Democratic Senator Pat McCarran, also known as the Subversive Activities Control Act and the Concentration Camp Law, which required communist organizations and sympathizers to register with the federal government and provided the US president emergency powers to place suspected communists into concentration camps. Also, additionally, can you discuss its reasoning and seeming push to bring it back, as well as its ramifications? Well, I'd heard of the McCarran Act, but haven't done the reading on it as of yet. That would enable me to comment on it more fully. So, but yes, I can do something on that in the near future. I will certainly come back to that. And also, YepX asks an additional question. Can you discuss how one can approach supporters of the corrupt power structure here in the United States and abroad without getting defensive or immediately blowing you off, to encourage them to take the time to educate themselves? Is that even possible? Well, I would say that the answer to your second question relates actually back to what we were just talking about with regard to scientific socialism. What's encouraged in the imperialist countries in terms of thinking, well, really not thinking at all, is reflected in like how we find people who become dissatisfied with the system but can't break out of it. That's what you find with a lot of people who, when they cast about for solutions as to why their lives are shit, will only look at other elements within the system, and they will fixate upon one thing and say it's that. If we can resolve that, then we can get back to something better. And what I find, and this is again my experience, is primarily in an old perfidious Albion, but I think this is also true for most of the imperialist countries. It's true, I think, for the United States, Canada, France, Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, etc. What you find with a lot of working class people, when you actually get into a discussion with them, even those who are advocates of like what are described as ultra reactionary or very reactionary political parties. So I remember a discussion I was part of it, but I won't claim I was the lead on it. Somebody else was having this discussion with an avowed supporter of Nigel Farage in this country. And what we found when discussing things like housing, when discussing things like, how public services should actually be run, how investing in industry, the need for reindustrialization, found that there was actually a lot of agreement between this supporter of Nigel Farage and ourselves. How could that possibly be, I hear you ask? Well, I think most of you probably know, but I will elaborate anyway. That a lot of these people, I'm not talking about the fascist guys, like the paid agents of the state, like Stephen Yaxley Lenin or various other characters in the United States. These are con men who are paid to be con men. Not talking about them. But the people who get swept along by, a Farage or a Trump, like if you get there, especially if they're working class, what you find when you talk to them is, yes, there'll be a lot of absurd ideas. Yes, there'll be ideas about immigration, about religious or racial minorities, which are very strange and often outright reactionary. But you actually start talking to them about the kind of society they want to see. Very few of them are going to say that they want a white Britain or a white US. Some will, some very, very small minority. Most of them, when it gets down to it, have a broadly social democratic mindset. It's what I've found when you start talking to these people. You put certain propositions to them. Again, you get past the whole immigration thing. You say, okay, do you think that the state should lead the way on like reindustrializing Britain? Yes or no? Most of them will agree. Do you think that everybody's entitled to housing and that the current housing model has failed? If they're working class, they'll agree. Because even if they are lost in like stupid ideas, stupid racist ideas, like they'll all know some people who can't get housing. Now they might blame it all on the immigrants, but they'll also know that at some level that the immigrants didn't set the house price where it is, and they also know that the house price bubble is a scam. You talk to them about the education system being crap, and most of them will agree with you. They might have funny ideas as to why it is, but they will agree with you. You talk about like what role the state should play in economic development, and most of them will basically come back to you with an idea of, very few of them, and these are even like the more middle class of them, very few of them are like ardent hardcore like libertarian like Austrian school types. Very few of them. You'll get the occasional one who's like some petty bourgeois golf enthusiast who still carries a picture of Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan in his wallet, but most of them have a broadly social democratic mindset, because that's what the great bulk of the population in these countries grew up with. Whether they're of the boomer generation, Gen X, or millennials, or most of them come up with the expectation, incorrectly, because this isn't how capitalism works, but because of the welfare capitalist period and the very deep changes that has had in terms of people's expectation of what the role of the state should be in terms of organizing the economy and society. A lot of them basically want to get back to welfare capitalism because, and again, that makes sense because that's the period through which they or their parents' generation did the best under capitalism, was the welfare capitalist period, so that they would have that mentality makes complete sense. So if you can get to the point where you can have that discussion with them, and I realize that in the United States there's a lot more funny ideas and reactionary ideas in the working class, even more than there are so here. But I think even in the US, when it comes to stuff like the ruinous costs of healthcare, when it comes to stuff like deindustrialization, like there'll be a majority there in the American working class, no matter how bizarre and reactionary their other beliefs are, that holds with a certain, shall we say, New Deal era mentality. And again, like Trump at various different points in 2016, at least, was sort of promising to get back to that. So the Democrats, to win elections, will periodically pretend they're going back to the Roosevelt era. They neither can nor will, of course. But again, it maintains a powerful hold, I think, and Americans feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, it maintains a powerful hold even amongst workers who vote for the Republicans. Because God knows most workers don't read the actual platforms of the bourgeois parties in the United States. There's no point in reading them. Everybody knows that. But if you put the propositions about what the state should do to a lot of American workers, my guess is that you would come back a lot of the time with sort of still New Deal type understandings, sort of Rooseveltian understandings of things. And again, it makes complete sense because that's the period in American history where the working class made the most economic advances, regardless of the flaws that we as Marxists all understand is there in welfare capitalism, and that it was always going to come to an end, and that the ruling class was always going to pull the rug on it at some point when they felt like they either were strong enough to, or they had no option other than to pull the rug on it. So this is all in the mix here, so to speak. So in terms of appealing to reactionaries, I would say that, or should we say, having a conversation with workers who are sort of lost in reactionary ideas, finding the point, finding what they actually, things that they believe in, things that they think should, as to how society should be organized, finding some points of agreement with them, and then building from that. And also bearing in mind, at this stage, we're not going to get the great bulk of the working class suddenly joining up to a communist party. What we're doing at this stage, and this relates back to the last question about scientific socialism as well, is we're looking to build resilient cores amongst the working class of worker communists. That's what we're looking to do. We're looking to start off the process of building communist parties by recruiting like a resilient and strong and politically well developed, as far as is possible, and with a decent level of theoretical understanding, communist cadres who can be active within the wider working class. That's what we're looking to do. That's a different project than that which the Social Democrats are engaged in. The Social Democrats, if we take them at their word, and there's no reason why we should, but let's do this as an experiment. Let's use the example of the United States. The DSA, the Democratic Socialists of the Democratic Party, or just Democrats, say that they're socialists. But what they really are is that they want to essentially get back to, they want to recreate welfare capitalism in the United States as of now. Now, we've been through on this channel on many different occasions why that's not possible or even desirable to do. But that's what the DSA is nominally for. Now, of course, the problem with them, one of the central problems with them, and all social democrats, is that they want desperately to find a way to shortcut a way back to that. And that's assuming that they are genuine. And I found this when okay, issue resolved, it would seem. There was a brief connection drop there, but we are back online now. So I hope that you got most of that. It was recorded, of course, so the audio recording of this will be up on the Patreon site, so you can listen to the audio version there. So going back to questions. Basically, yes. To answer President Jesus' comment, the internet basically anywhere in a lot of Britain sucks fucking balls. It really does. Comment from Wicked Witch of the Southeast. Says overcoming the completely infantilized mindset of people here is the most difficult part. A great cement door to their taking responsibility for anything, never mind for the whole as a class. Well, this is a big part of the problem, and again, it's the reason why what we're starting off with is like identifying those who can be essentially agitators, organizers within the wider working class, and finding them first. And again, that's not an easy it's not an easy thing. And then through them talking to the wider working class. This is no easy thing, but this is why you can't, if you try and run things right now as, let's assume that your party was serious about doing so. Let's assume for a moment that this is what they actually wanted to do. Was that we're going to have these mass democratic assemblies where things will be debated and that will form the basis of our party. Well, let's be honest. What you're going to be having there is a debate between various different types of people who are various differing shades of social democrat, who all, or in many cases, will have completely the wrong idea as to how Britain as an imperialist country operates. That's the truth, because social democrats in the Western world often, in fact, almost always do have completely the wrong idea about how the economy of the country operates. They're completely wrong about it. They're completely wrong about what generated welfare capitalism in the first place. They're completely wrong about what destroyed it, and they're completely wrong about the possibilities of bringing it back. So what we want to do is to get away from that. Now, there's an argument to say that if there's some sort of mass social democratic organization being birthed, as well hasn't been the case now, that communists should have some sort of orientation towards that. But I think where our orientation towards that should be is that we are looking to talk to people within it about, well, okay, you say you want policy X, Y, and Z, but this is the very worst type of vehicle that you could have to actually be able to get to that point. It's just not possible. The only way you'd be able to shove a reform through the British parliamentary system was if the masses were holding a gun to the head of the ruling class, collectively speaking. We're not there yet. So again, we got a long period of struggle ahead, and we have to go through a long period of overcoming, not just bad ideas, but bad methods of organization, like backward methods of political education. To go back to where we started from, the active hostility of not just the younger end of the population, but all of the supposedly politicized population in this country, has an active hostility towards real political education. The promotion of dumb shit by the ruling class has been very successful. Now, ultimately, this will have to be overcome, and what we were looking to do now is to put down the roots that will enable us to grow a solid and sustainable organization into the future. Not easy, because it's something which is going to be very, very difficult, but this is the route we have to take. Now, how we do this, the various tactics we adopt at each stage of the struggle, that's an open question at this stage. But right now, it's about us re-establishing strong communist roots in working class communities and building from there. Sid says it was 40 years of struggle, a crisis in the system, and a large fissure in the bourgeois that brought about social democracy, or a lightweight form of it in America. Very, very true. President Jesus says, does Jeremy equals Oasis and Zara equals Blur in this petty bourgeois dispute? Well, neither of them are particularly working class. Both are tuneless. I mean, in fairness to, musically speaking, in fairness to Blur, some of their later stuff was a little bit more interesting. But when it was Oasis versus Blur, Oasis were probably the better choice, if only because they didn't have they were a little bit more honest in what they were doing. But to go back to the actual question from President Jesus there, to steal a phrase from Zizek, both are worse in this case, because what you have here is this isn't even a dispute in the Labour Party in the early 1970s. This is a bottom of the barrel fight between Corbyn, who is a ridiculous old sellout, and Sultana, who is politically clueless, a phenomenally clueless individual. She's not alone, of course. That goes for the great bulk of those who consider themselves to be social democrats. They are, again, as I've said over and over again, utterly clueless as to how to actually organize anything, as to what they're actually up against. So even if Zara Sultana is completely genuine, she's still all over the place when it comes to her understanding of the situation, which is why she does really stupid things puts gender ideology and fucking trans rights and shit like that on the same level as the Palestinian struggle, and why the collection of smug idiots that surround her do the same thing. These people aren't serious. They might think they are, but they're not. These people's understanding of the world is just cartoonishly wrong. Corbyn, at a certain stage in his life, did know better, but he seems to not really exist as an independent entity anymore. He seems to just be a sort of plaything, or a shall we say, a piece on a board pushed around by other players, of whom more will be said in later episodes of Decline and Fall, I am sure. So we've got a real mess, basically, is the way that I'm sort of bringing this point to a conclusion. And the only way around it is essentially to understand that this is a mess, that we have to go back to not the drawing board. We have to appreciate before we can appreciate the challenge, we have to actually understand the crisis that we are in. And that is that decades of a poor understanding of politics within the working class, and decades of, shall we say, cartoonish actions by social democrats have put us in a position where we need to rebuild from the foundations upwards. So, okay, well, that's that challenge needs to be actually appreciated before we can properly address it. Okay, so it's been a couple of hours now, so I'm going to draw things to a close for today. Apologies if you've asked a question in the comments and I've not got to it, but I need to get on and do some other stuff. I'm taking a note of those who've asked for shows in the future on various different things. I will look to put something together on that. Thanks to all those who support the program. So thanks to YepX and others who've contributed to the Buy Me a Coffee account. Thanks to all those who financially support the show on Patreon. We've now got going on the Patreon a new series. As indicated, it's film reviews have returned. I'm going to be doing reviews of a lot of the works of Martin Scorsese, So we did Casino last week, and that was very well received. So thank you for that. Upcoming week, we will be doing Goodfellas. So, and because we've got the internet largely sorted now, we can do that as a video. So be sure to tune in for that. That should be Wednesday of this week. We have there'll be other stuff coming up on the Patreon as well, because I'm looking to expand the amount of programming that goes on there. So again, thanks to everybody who supports the show that way. Thanks to everybody who's watched. Be sure to like the stream, to subscribe to the channel, and to spread the good word wherever you can. At a time of mass deception and the mass adoption of piss poor ideas, we hope to, in our small way, redress the balance. So thank you for tuning in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow, when we're going to be doing a catch up on the Ukraine war. So be sure to join us for that one. See you again then. And until then, here is your musical outroduction.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.